Here is a question that sounds stupidly simple until you actually think about it. Why do humans cook? Sketch was standing in his kitchen at 11 at night, staring at a pot of water on the stove, waiting for it to boil. He had a handful of pasta in one hand and his phone in the other, scrolling through nothing in particular. When a thought hit him so hard, he actually put the phone down. Every other animal on Earth eats its food raw. He looked at the pot. He looked at the dry pasta. He looked out the window into the dark backyard where he knew squirrels and raccoons and birds were out there right now, eating whatever they found, exactly as they found it. No heat, no preparation, no waiting for water to boil at 11 at night. Lions do not marinate their kills. Gorillas do not roast their fruit. Dolphins have never once assembled anything that could fairly be called a meal. And yet here was Sketch, a stick figure in a kitchen, doing something that every single human culture ever discovered has done. Every culture, every continent, every climate. From the most isolated hunter-gatherer communities in remote forests to the most advanced industrial cities on the planet, all of them cook. Sketch turned off the stove. The pasta could wait. He needed to understand this. He sat down at his desk and started reading, and what he found over the next several hours genuinely changed the way he understood himself, his body, and the entire trajectory of the human species. The first thing Sketch learned was that cooking is not just common among humans. It is the one genuinely universal human behavior, not language, which varies enormously in structure and form across cultures. Not tool use, which other animals also practice in varying degrees. Not music, or religion, or trade. Cooking. Heat deliberately applied to food before eating. Only humans do it. All humans do it. And humans have been doing it for so long that they have become, in a very real biological sense, dependent on it. That last part stopped Sketch cold. Dependent on it. Not dependent on cooking the way he was dependent on his phone or his morning coffee. Dependent on it the way a fish is dependent on water. Dependent on it because the human body has been reshaped over hundreds of thousands of years of evolutionary pressure into a form that is optimized for cooked food and genuinely cannot function properly without it. Sketch looked down at his own stick figure jaw. Small, delicate, nothing like the massive crushing jaws he had seen on chimpanzees in documentaries. His gut, he now realized, was short. His teeth were small. His entire digestive architecture was different from that of every other primate on the planet, and it was different in ways that pointed unmistakably toward a body built around processed, heated food. These were not design flaws. They were the physical record of an ancestor who made one of the most consequential decisions in the history of life on Earth and then had their entire body reorganized around that decision over the course of 1,000,000 years. The wildest part, Sketch thought, rubbing his stick figure forehead, was that nobody fully knows how it started. Nobody knows if the first cooking was deliberate or accidental. Nobody knows whether some ancient ancestor watched food fall into a wildfire and tasted something extraordinary, or whether someone deliberately placed food near flames after noticing that fire changed things, or whether the discovery was something more gradual and methodical than any single dramatic moment. Nobody even knows with certainty whether the first cooked meal was meat or plants. What is known is that whenever the first hominid first tasted food that had been heated by fire and recognized it as better, something clicked, something irreversible occurred. And the species was never the same. Sketch decided he needed to go back, way back. To understand the before, because that is what makes the after genuinely astonishing, he closed his eyes and imagined himself 2,000,000 years ago on the African savanna. The world looked completely different. The hominid lineage, our ancestors, upright walking and increasingly clever, was still running the same dietary playbook that chimpanzees run today. Lots of raw fruit, raw roots, which are tough, fibrous, and barely digestible, raw leaves, bark, shoots, whatever insects and occasional small animals could be grabbed on the go. Sketch watched his ancient ancestor chewing and chewing and chewing some more. The ancestor spent roughly half of all waking hours just eating, not hunting, not socializing, not doing anything interesting or complex, just chewing, because raw food requires so much mechanical processing before the body can extract anything useful from it. A Harvard anthropologist named Richard Wrangham spent years studying chimpanzees in Uganda, eating the same wild foods they ate. His conclusion was straightforward. The food was genuinely terrible. hard, fibrous, bitter, extremely unpleasant to chew for the extended time required to actually swallow it. He spent 10 minutes on a single piece of wild fruit and got essentially nothing enjoyable from the experience. After extensive personal experimentation with the primate raw food diet, Wrangham came away convinced of something important. No human being, with our comparatively small jaws and short digestive tracts, could survive on such a diet. Not just would not want to, biologically could not extract enough calories from raw primate food to sustain a functioning human body over the long term. Sketch opened his eyes. He was back at his desk, but the implication was enormous. If humans cannot survive on what other primates eat, if our bodies are genuinely anatomically unsuited to the raw food diet our distant ancestors relied on, then at some point, something must have changed. Something must have allowed us to get dramatically more energy from food. Something must have freed us from spending half our lives chewing. What was it? The answer Wrangham arrived at, while staring into his fireplace in Cambridge, Massachusetts, in 1997, was cooking. Not meat eating, which others had proposed as the great dietary turning point. Not bigger brains leading to better foraging strategies. Cooking. Fire applied to food before it enters the body. The hypothesis Wrangham published and later expanded in his book, Catching Fire, is that cooking was not merely a cultural development that accompanied human evolution as a useful side benefit. Cooking was the engine of human evolution. We did not develop big brains, and then, with those brains, eventually figure out cooking. We cooked, or stumbled into cooking, and as a direct biological consequence of that dietary shift, our brains grew. Sketch stared at the wall. The causal arrow runs in the opposite direction from what most people assume. To understand why, Sketch realized he needed to understand what heat actually does to food at a molecular level, because it is far more transformative than most people appreciate. He pulled up his notebook and started drawing tiny circles, molecules, the invisible architecture of food that he had never once thought about in his entire life. Picture a raw potato, he muttered to himself, sketching one on the page. Inside that potato, the starch is packed into tight, dense, crystalline granules. Imagine tiny locked safes, each one stuffed with calories, but sealed shut so thoroughly that your digestive enzymes bounce right off them. They cannot get in. The energy is there, locked inside, but your body cannot access most of it. Now picture what happens when you drop that potato into boiling water. When you apply heat to a starchy food, a potato, a grain, a yam, the heat causes the starch granules inside the food to absorb water and swell dramatically. Scientists call this process gelatinization. The tight crystalline structure of raw starch, which makes it physically difficult for digestive enzymes to access the caloric content locked inside, breaks down into a much more open, swollen, accessible form. Sketch drew a raw potato on the left, dense, locked, impenetrable. Then he drew the same potato on the right after cooking. Open, swollen, available. Your digestive enzymes can now reach vastly more of the starch and convert it to glucose. You are eating the same object and getting dramatically more energy out of it simply because it has been heated. Heat does something equally significant to protein. Raw meat contains tough connective tissue, collagen, elastin, and other structural proteins that are genuinely difficult to break down during digestion. Heat denatures these proteins, unraveling their complex three-dimensional structures into simpler, extended forms that digestive enzymes can attack far more efficiently. It also ruptures the cell walls of plant food, releasing nutrients that were locked inside cellulose structures your digestive system cannot break through on its own. Cooking neutralizes many of the natural toxins and anti-nutrients present in raw food too, compounds that plants evolved specifically to discourage animals from eating them. Heat destroys these defensive chemicals, making foods accessible that were genuinely dangerous or nutritionally blocked in their raw form. Sketch sat back and looked at his drawings. Cooking is, in a very real biochemical sense, predigestion. You are doing a substantial portion of the chemical work of breaking food down before you even put it in your mouth. Fire acts as your external stomach, which means your actual digestive system gets a dramatically easier job and has to expend substantially less energy completing the process. The result is striking. significantly more usable calories extracted from the same amount of food, with considerably less metabolic expenditure required to get them. Sketch picked up a raw carrot from his kitchen counter and bit into it. Hard, crunchy. He chewed for a while, feeling the effort in his jaw. Then he thought about what chewing was like for his ancestors before cooking. Not a carrot for a few minutes, but tough fibrous roots and raw leaves for 5 or 6 hours a day, every single day, for their entire lives. Cooked food is dramatically softer. The structural components that made raw food hard to chew, the fibrous cell walls, the tough connective tissue, the dense starch granules, have all been broken down by heat before the food reaches the mouth. Wrangham estimated that before cooking, hominids may have spent close to half their waking hours chewing. After cooking became routine, that time dropped to something much closer to the hour or so that modern humans typically spend on eating daily. Sketch did the math in his head and nearly fell out of his chair. He grabbed a piece of paper and wrote the numbers down. Before cooking, roughly 6 hours of chewing per day. After cooking, roughly 1 hour per day. The difference is 5 hours. 5 hours freed up every single day, across an entire lifetime, across an entire population, across hundreds of thousands of years of accumulated generations. That represents 4 to 5 additional productive hours per day, freed from the simple biological necessity of mechanically processing enough raw food to stay alive. 4 or 5 hours every day. For hundreds of thousands of years. He started listing what ancestors could do with that reclaimed time. Hunt more effectively and with better strategy. Make more sophisticated tools. Maintain social bonds within and between groups. Teach skills and knowledge to younger generations. Sleep more and more safely, because fire also provided protection from nocturnal predators, allowing sleep on the ground rather than in trees. Explore larger territories. Plan for the future rather than spending every available moment on the immediate necessity of eating. The campfire was not just a cooking device. It was simultaneously a security perimeter against predators, a warmth source that extended the range of comfortable habitats, a social gathering point that enabled sustained group interaction, and a time-liberating technology whose effects compounded across generations. And then Sketch got to the part that genuinely stopped him in his tracks. What happened to the human body in the fossil record around the time cooking is thought to have begun? About 1.8 million years ago, something significant and relatively abrupt happened. Homo erectus emerged. And compared to its predecessors, it looked dramatically different. Bigger brain, which had increased substantially in volume relative to body size. Taller, longer-legged body architecture, better suited to sustained running. And, critically, smaller jaws, smaller teeth, and a significantly shorter digestive tract. Sketch focused on the gut reduction because it is one of the most striking anatomical changes in the entire fossil record. In chimpanzees and other primates, the digestive system is enormous relative to body size. A long, expansive apparatus with a large stomach, a lengthy small intestine, and an especially large colon dedicated to slowly fermenting and extracting nutrients from huge quantities of difficult raw plant material. This massive gut is expensive to maintain. It requires a constant large blood supply. It generates substantial heat. It demands enormous amounts of food simply to keep itself running. In Homo erectus, this apparatus had shrunk substantially. Less gut overall, a proportionally smaller colon in particular. In modern humans, this trend has continued to the point where, as one researcher put it memorably, whereas other primates have guts that weigh roughly 4 times as much as their brains, the human brain actually weighs more than the human gut. Sketch drew this out slowly, gut dominant to brain dominant, a profound reorganization of biological priorities, less gut, more brain. And the only way that trade is biologically sustainable is if the food getting into that smaller gut is dramatically more calorie-dense and easily digestible than what came before. Cooked food. Softer cooked food requires less powerful jaws and smaller teeth. Natural selection relaxed the pressure to maintain the enormous chewing apparatus that raw food primates require. Teeth and jaws gradually shrank over generations. More digestible, more calorie-dense cooked food means you need substantially less gut to process an adequate daily intake. Natural selection could downsize the digestive system without reducing fitness. And the metabolic energy saved by maintaining less gut tissue was freed for reallocation. And it was reallocated to the most calorie-hungry organ in the body. The brain. The human brain consumes roughly 20% of the body's total energy budget. It burns about 9 times more energy per unit of tissue than other body parts require. It is the most metabolically demanding organ in the body relative to its size. Brazilian neuroscientist Susana Herculano Hausel calculated the numbers explicitly. For a gorilla to grow a human-sized brain while subsisting on its current raw food diet, it would need to eat for an additional 2 hours per day on top of the 8 or 9 hours it already spends feeding. That brings the total to something like 10 or 11 hours of eating daily, which leaves almost no time for anything else. The math simply does not work for a raw food, large-brained primate. The only path to a bigger brain, given these constraints, is making food more efficient. Cooking did that decisively and irreversibly. Sketch leaned back in his chair and let that sink in. Cooking did not accompany human evolution as a pleasant side effect. Cooking drove it. The fire came first. The brain followed. He pulled up the archaeological evidence next. The oldest confirmed physical evidence of controlled fire use comes from Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, where burned bone fragments and ashed plant remains found deep inside the cave have been dated to approximately 1 million years ago. A separate discovery at Gesher Beno Yaakov in northern Israel identified carefully heated freshwater fish teeth dating to 780,000 years ago. The oldest direct evidence of cooking food specifically, as opposed to fire use more generally. These dates sit in interesting tension with the hypothesis. If cooking began with Homo erectus around 1.8 million years ago, there are roughly 800,000 years of missing archaeological evidence. The explanation, and it is a plausible one, is that fire evidence from small temporary campfires in open environments simply does not preserve well over geological timescales. The fires of modern hunter-gatherer communities are modest, short-lived affairs that would leave essentially no detectable trace in sediment after a million years. By around 400,000 years ago, the archaeological evidence for fire use is abundant, widespread, and unambiguous. Ancient hearths, burned animal bones, fire-cracked stones, earth ovens, across sites in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East. By the time Neanderthals and early modern Homo sapiens were active, fire and cooking were clearly well-established, culturally transmitted behaviors. Sketch nodded slowly. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Especially when the thing you are looking for is a small campfire from a million years ago in an open grassland exposed to rain, wind, erosion, and geological upheaval for 1,000 centuries. It would be stranger if we had found early fire evidence than that we have not. The question of when exactly the practice began remains open. That it began is not seriously in doubt. Then he got to the part that genuinely unsettled him. Humans cannot survive on raw food. Not in a this would be inconvenient way. In a biologically demonstrable, measurably catastrophic way. Contemporary studies of people who choose to eat entirely raw, unprocessed, unheated food as a lifestyle choice consistently find that they cannot maintain body weight over time on raw diet alone. They use more metabolic energy to process the raw food than the additional nutrients extracted can cover. They run a caloric deficit that worsens over time. Up to 50% of women on strict raw food diets develop amenorrhea, the cessation of menstruation, which is the body's emergency signal that it has insufficient energy to support the metabolic costs of reproduction. The body shuts down fertility before it shuts down anything else. Sketch felt a chill move through his stick-figure body. He read that statistic again. 50%, half of the women on strict raw food diets lost their ability to reproduce. Not because of illness, not because of injury. Because their bodies simply did not have enough energy to keep the reproductive system running and decided, at a deep biological level, to shut it down rather than risk producing a child the body could not support. From an evolutionary perspective, a diet that stops half your reproductively capable females from being able to have children is the most fitness-destroying dietary choice imaginable. It is not a suboptimal strategy. It is not a minor disadvantage. It is a one-way ticket to extinction within a single generation. Any population that adopted a permanent raw food diet would shrink and vanish with terrifying speed. The study of raw food enthusiasts provides a controlled modern experiment that validates the hypothesis. Our bodies, reshaped by hundreds of thousands of years of cooking, have lost the infrastructure needed to extract adequate nutrition from raw food. The large fermenting colon is gone. The powerful jaw and extensive molar surface area are gone. The slow, patient digestive system capable of wringing nutrition from raw fiber over extended processing time is gone. What replaced them, the shorter, more efficient gut, the smaller jaw, the bigger brain, only works as a viable biological package if the food coming in has already been pre-processed by heat. Chimpanzees can survive on raw food because their bodies are built for it from the ground up. Enormous guts, powerful jaws, teeth designed for sustained mechanical processing, metabolic rates calibrated for slow, inefficient extraction from raw material. Humans are built for cooked food. Our bodies crossed a threshold somewhere between 1 and 2 million years ago from which there was no evolutionary return. Sketch wrote this down slowly. The body adapted incrementally to cooked input, shed the infrastructure it no longer needed, redirected that metabolic investment to the brain, and became irreversibly committed to a dietary strategy that requires technology to execute. No fire. No food worth eating. No cooking. No survival. The cooking ape. The only animal in the history of life on Earth that genuinely cannot feed itself without a tool. Then, Sketch discovered the social consequences, and they were almost as significant as the biological ones. Cooking creates a meal. A shared, prepared thing produced at a specific time and place, consumed communally. This is not a trivial social innovation. When your food must be cooked, you gather somewhere to cook it. You need fire, which takes effort to maintain. You need people to guard it, to tend it, to protect whatever is being prepared. You need some organizing principle for who contributes what and who receives what in return. The campfire is not just a cooking surface. It is the origin of the household, the most fundamental unit of human social organization. Sketch imagined his ancient ancestors gathered around a modest fire in the African dusk. One brought roots dug from the riverbank. Another brought meat from a hunt that had taken most of the afternoon. A third tended the fire, keeping it alive, adjusting the embers, making sure the heat stayed even and the flames did not die. They cooked together. They waited together. They talked or made whatever sounds passed for talking before full language existed. They ate together, passing food, sharing portions, feeding children who could not yet forage for themselves. They watched the flames push back the darkness and the predators beyond it. Hyenas circled at a distance, but came no closer. The night was dangerous, but the circle of firelight was safe. The fire was where a pair bond became useful, where having a reliable partner who would protect your cooked food while you were away, gathering more raw ingredients, and who would share the cooked output with you and your children, gave you a real survival advantage over being a solitary raw food forager competing with everyone around you. The household organized around a cooking fire is the seed from which the most fundamental human social institutions grew. And then consider what happens when people gather around a fire in the evening. Caloric needs met, predators held at distance by the flame, hours of free time available before sleep. Language flourishes in this context. Storytelling becomes possible and useful. Transmitting information about where food was found, what dangers were encountered, which social relationships need attention, laughter, music, planning, the rehearsal of future strategies. All of these become possible when you are not spending every waking moment either chewing or searching for more raw food to chew. The cooking fire did not just feed the brain. It created the conditions in which the brain could start doing the things that eventually made us recognizably human. Thinking about the past, planning for the future, transmitting accumulated knowledge across generations. Sketch walked back to his kitchen. The pot of water had gone cold. The pasta was still sitting on the counter, dry and waiting. He turned the burner back on, watched the blue flame catch and spread, listened to the quiet tick of the stove igniting, and, for the first time in his life, he understood the full weight of what he was doing. He was participating in the oldest, most consequential, and most singularly human technology in the entire history of the species. Older than agriculture by at least 1 million years. Older than any written language by far. Older than any religion, city, civilization, or government. Older, arguably, than language itself. He was doing something that his ancestors were doing around modest fires on the African savanna more than 1 million years ago, and it was something that rewired the trajectory of the primate lineage completely. It shrank his jaw, shortened his gut, freed his time, protected his nights, organized his social world, and liberated enough biological energy to build and sustain the brain that he was using right now at 11 at night, standing in his kitchen, watching pasta water slowly come back to a boil. Every meal he cooked was, in the deepest possible sense, a continuation of the act that made him human in the first place. Which is a genuinely profound thought, even when you are doing it at 11 at night with questionable leftovers, standing in your kitchen in the dark, realizing the pasta is stuck to the bottom of the pan. Sketch smiled, scraped the pasta free, and ate it standing up by the stove. He thought about the first ancestor who tasted something that fire had touched and recognized it as better. That anonymous hominid standing near a dying wildfire on a savanna that no longer exists, picking up a root or a piece of meat that the flames had changed, biting into it and experiencing something entirely new, something softer, something richer, something that filled the belly faster and left energy to spare. That single moment, repeated and refined and passed from parent to child across 100,000 generations, built the world Sketch was standing in right now. The kitchen, the stove, the pot, the language he was thinking in, the brain doing the thinking. 1 million years of evolution, and here he was, still cooking, still human, still standing by the fire.